also just let you guys know, yes, you are in the right talk. All right, get started. Let me know if you can't hear me or anything if I wander too far away. So thanks everyone for coming today. It's really exciting to see a full room. Hopefully I'll have something for all of you. This talk is kind of aimed at artists, I suppose, but it has a lot of concepts that cross disciplines, which is the whole point of my talk. So for those of you who don't already know me, my name is Hannah. I work at Gameloft. They really wanted to let you know about that. And I'm going to talk to you about my experience transferring from being a digital artist working in video games to being an artist who worked in theatre and film, and my experience going from digital to analog and why that's not as hard as you might think, and what the training in traditional art and art practices and practical fabrication taught me that I was able to bring back to contribute to my digital work, and why I think that diversifying as an artist is important and what that can look like and what that can mean. And I guess my talk might be a little bit unusual at a games conference because it's not actually primarily about games, it's about art. So my backstory in a nutshell is that I had a fairly successful career as a 3D artist in games for quite a number of years here in Australia and over in the UK, but I came back from the UK at a particularly bad time just when the GFC was really putting the crunch on Brisbane games. And the company I worked at and a number of other ones all closed down within the month that I arrived back in the country. So that wasn't fun. And at that point, I decided that I was going to retrain in theatre originally to go into practical making in film. And at the time, I really saw it as expanding my skill set as an artist rather than getting out of games specifically. Because I actually came back to games. I've dabbled as a freelancer while I was also doing film, and now I do that again as my permanent role. So when GCAP asked me to send in a photo for their marketing material, I really wanted to send in this photo of me from last year where I had a red mohawk and leopard print on the side, which, I mean, there's so many people sporting amazing hairstyles here. I thought you guys would be really disappointed when I turned up and I'd shaved it all off. So I'm going to start with that slide. So this is the other work that I do when I'm in film. This is me carving a head for King Kong for Kong vs. Godzilla. So that's a big block of polystyrene that I'm working on there. Because I have such a broad set of experience and this is quite a deep topic, I'm only going to be able to skim over a bunch of examples. So I'm going to give you a quick roadmap to what I'm going to be talking about. So going digital to analog, leaving games and going into film. What skills could I actually transfer as a digital artist? And in terms of transferring skill sets, what's the difference between the tools that we use and the principles of art that actually work across different disciplines? And why having a traditional art background is really important as an artist for that reason. And then going analog back to digital. What kind of traditional art concepts were actually relevant and what techniques from my practical making could I bring back to help me become a better digital artist? Why being familiar with real materials is really important even though you're working in digital, and what diversifying looks like and why that can make you a stronger, more resilient artist. So, starting digital to analog. Like, how does a digital artist even start? So how do you even? My first step was I actually retrained at the National Institute of Dramatic Art. Some of you may have heard of it because of its acting courses. They also run fabrication courses for the practical side of making film and theatre. And my first job was to convince this panel of interviewers that my digital background actually had some relevance, that I was going to be able to do this course without having had any practical training as an artist at this point. And I found in having to explain that, that there is a huge amount of overlap. See what I did there? And part of the reason is that the way that we practice digital art today is actually modelled on the way that we have created practical art in the past. That's what a lot of our digital programs are attempting to do, is replicate those methods. And obviously there's a lot of big art concepts that cross over completely. Things like color theory and composition. You don't have to be working in a particular medium for those to apply. So I'm going to give you some examples, some simple little ones, and then some bigger concepts, and also some things about practical making and approaching projects. So these two pictures should hopefully look pretty similar to you. When I was doing my course, it was a very traditional fabrication course, and we had to learn traditional drafting techniques where we actually drew the technical drawings for creating objects. So we've got the perspective views there and all of the orthographic ones, which look surprisingly similar to the viewport in Maya or many other 3D programs that you might be familiar with. The reason, of course, is very simple. These 3D programs were originally all designed as CAD programs to replicate the format that drafting artists were familiar with. So I was simply going back to the original source material. Pattern making and UV unwrapping, again, spot the similarities. These ones aren't necessarily designed on each other, but that same technique of understanding the connection between the 2D flat pattern-like shapes in UV unwrapping and where the seams join together and the three-dimensional object that they're actually representing was a very important concept that allowed me to grasp the concepts of pattern making very quickly. Again, spot the similarities. So white cards and white boxes. You might know them as grey boxes or blocking out, but I like white boxes because that's what I learnt, and I like the mirroring of those concepts. So white cards are used in film and theatre as well, and obviously that's where the original concept came from. And they use them for exactly the same reason that we do, which is like a proof of concept before they start constructing something. To block out, for example, where the actors are going to move around the set, how the lighting is going to interact with the elements in the set, and where they're going to be able to place the cameras in, whether they need to remove any walls, for example, to get cameras into certain positions. So digital programs are largely a real benefit to artists because they make our job so much easier. And the one thing that I really missed about moving from digital to practical as an artist was the undo button, and closely followed by copy and paste. Because obviously this just allows us to work so much faster. But I found that I could apply the same sort of concept that I would use in populating a level with objects to making a whole bunch of assets for a... See, I still cross over with language. This was always a problem with me transferring over to practical art, the terminology. Making a whole bunch of props for a theatre set like this. So you might notice that there's a whole bunch of wrought iron lamp arms populated around the set here. And there was about 12 of those that I had to make. And they would have been really time consuming to handcraft physically every single one of those. So I used a concept that I would use from straight out video games, which is I copy-pasted them. I created a mold, which for those of you guys who haven't worked with those before, is basically like a negative impression or a negative Boolean of an original object, which you then pour a material which will set into it, and you copy out another positive and another one, however many you need. So that's the object down the bottom. And I was able to copy and paste those and very quickly populate my set using the same method of thinking about it, I suppose, that I would approach placing props within an environment in a level. So this is one that should be fairly self-explanatory. This is one of those big concepts that you really don't need to relearn if you go into a new medium, because all these concepts cross over. But I suppose it is still really intimidating going from that big block of polystyrene on the left. Yes, it's polystyrene, not marble. Film isn't that fancy. We don't have the budget. Also, that stuff's much softer to carve. But going from something like that to the Lamassu, it's a winged Assyrian bull god that I had to make for Dora and the Lost City. And you can encounter the same sort of writer's block or an artist staring at a blank canvas, looking at a block like that and going, where do I even start turning that into this? But the thing was, I could approach it exactly the same way that I had always done with a 3D model when I was doing block modelling or polygonal modelling. So like we were talking about with the orthographic views, I could, the same way I would set up image planes in a 3D program, I would project the image that I wanted directly onto the side and draw it over it, and then cut out the silhouette, and then slowly increase the complexity of the number of sides of that object. Then once I've got all of the basic shapes blocked in, start refining the anatomy, and eventually add the details. The process was exactly the same, and it gave me a real advantage when I was going from digital stuff. In my course, I was probably the one who had the most sculpting experience, even though I had never really sculpted with physical materials, but the process is exactly the same. But of course, that's not the only way that you can approach doing modelling. You might be familiar with the idea of taking something like a poser model, a very simple three-dimensional model, and bringing it into a program like ZBrush where you can add detail and you can deform it and shape it into the object that you're trying to create. So on Dora and the Lost City, this is not mine. This was made by some of the really amazing sculptors who work in the physical sculpting studio there. But they were given some polystyrene models which looked a lot like the ones on the right. I couldn't find an original photograph, but the idea was someone had found a 3D model of a horse and they'd had it machine milled out of polystyrene, so CNC milled. And they thought, well, we'll just give this to the sculptors and then they can add some details and that'll really speed up the process. Problem is, you start out with a bad model, you get a bad model. And the concept looked much more like the picture over on the left here. So, your left? You're right. God, that's going to mess with me. So what they ended up doing was the same way if you had started with a very simplified model in a 3D sculpting program. They cut it at all of the limbs, reposed it into a more dynamic pose, and then added self-setting expanding foam onto the areas that needed bulking out and carved back into it to get the much more realistic anatomy that you see there. So another concept, lighting, which is like sculpting. It's one of those things that when you know it, you can apply the same concepts to any industry that you work in. And I actually came across a really great CG Masters Academy talk on that subject, which you can see down the bottom there, where the tutor was talking about the way that he taught lighting being software agnostic. I love that phrase so much, I'm going to steal it. He said he would teach it in a way that it really didn't matter what piece of technology, what software you were using, the concepts would cross over all of them and be relevant. And I think it goes further than that, because once you know lighting concepts, you know sculpting concepts, you know compositional concepts, all of those things transfer over no matter what program you're using, whether you're sculpting in clay or in ZBrush. But as a digital artist, did I completely give up doing anything digital or using my 3D artist skills when I went into practical making? I didn't have to, because practical fabrication is now moving into a real era of using those 3D skills. Like I mentioned before with the CNC milling, having 3D sculptors create models that are exactly what they want them to look like, and using the machines to simply speed up the fabrication process. So I'm not actually drilling into this thing here. This is all staged, it's the magic of film. But my 3D skills did get me my first job on Thor Ragnarok, which is where this is from. And this is the first 3D model that I had to create for them. So I created that in Maya, and they sent it to the CNC miller and milled it out of a big block of polystyrene, like the one you saw before, and then it was hand finished and painted. And I also created some 3D props for Dora and the Lost City. So that's the original ZBrush sculpt over on the side there. I'm not even going to go with left and right anymore. And then there's the plastic printed version and the final one that you actually see in film, which has just had a scenic coat of paint put on it. So I guess this is one of the real key things I learned going back to practical methods, was that I was going back to the origin of the sort of art that we make as digital artists. Or, as this would be a meme within a meme, understanding where we come from as artists and why our digital programs actually work the way that they do. So I was beginning to understand that it wasn't really a matter of digital versus analog or even games versus film. it was actually identifying what are principles versus what are methods, and seeing that allowed me to transfer my skills back and forth between industries much more effectively. Initially, I thought that my career progression was going to look something like this, that I was training and retraining, going from industry to industry, and that I was essentially falling behind in the industry that I'd left and then having to retrain in the industry that I was going back into. And I was worried about what this was doing to my progression as an artist, you know, as a career consideration, but also from my skills-based as well. But eventually I realized that it kind of looked something like this, that there were periods of having to retrain and catch up with new advances in, say, games when I got back into them, but that ultimately I was building on my skills rather than flip-flopping backwards and forwards. So how do you do that, considering you're going between different industries? And it was partly understanding this concept. So artistic technique and proficiency with the software or the tools isn't the same thing. And there's more to having training as an artist. You know, conceptual art training and observational skills, they're the transferable skills between different industries. Technical software skills aren't really where an artist contributes their value. I've seen artists hired who didn't use the software of the company that they were being hired into. And that's because software skills can be taught relatively quickly. But developing your art skills, that thing that gives you an eye for what looks good, takes years of diverse experience and training and practice. Traditional art concepts don't really change. They're based on quirks of the way that human beings see the world and perceive objects. And so they're kind of universal. They're not really specific to any particular medium or discipline. And those are the skills that you can take with you and build on as you move from different areas within games or different industries outside of games. Now, artists are constantly updating our technical software skills. We have to, because new editions of the software comes out, different techniques are created, like going from bump mapping to normal maps. But we shouldn't confuse keeping up to date with technical advances as the same thing as our artistic training. And ultimately, we need both to be really good artists. So, for those of you wondering what kind of principles I'm talking about, this is a super quick overview of just some of the ideas. And you may have heard different terminology, and obviously I've missed out a huge amount. It's a really broad subject, which is why I said I'm only going to be able to really touch on a lot of things. But there's also things like creative project skills, understanding how to set up a pipeline for completing a creative project, how to plan and how to problem solve, that you can learn regardless of the specific industry that you happen to be working in. There's a quote that I really like. The man who grasps principles can successfully select his own methods, but the man who tries methods ignoring principles is sure to have trouble. Or, as Jeff would say, they were so preoccupied with whether they could, they didn't stop to think whether they should. Basically, this is all trying to say the difference between how to use a tool and when to use a tool and why to use that particular one. The methods versus the principles. So what kind of principles was I actually able to bring back into digital work? So, it was taking the journey I found actually, the going there and coming back again, which was the really enriching experience becoming a better digital artist. Some of the examples I'm going to show you are really simple little ones that are kind of self-evident in retrospect. Some of them are big concept stuff, and again, some of them are that sort of how to manage a creative project, how to approach a creative project. So, beveling, or as you may know it, chamfering, which is basically the technique of knocking the edges off an object to create a slightly more rounded edge between two shapes that meet at a very sharp point. And I actually really absorbed the lesson of this in my carpentry class at NIDA, where our carpentry teacher was talking about, the phrase they use is arrising, which is just knocking that edge off a freshly made wooden object so that you don't have that real sharp edge on it. And he said it's the quickest way of making your carpentry projects appear more professional, more finished, more polished. And I think that really applies to 3D art as well. But obviously sometimes we don't have the ability to add the extra polys. We're on a budget. And so we have the advantage of being able to do it in texture as well. And I realized that although I'd been creating hand-painted textures for years, that this is why we add that particular highlight to all of the edges. And it really creates a sense of weight. This is why you bevel edges. It creates a sense of mass and heaviness without actually having to change the silhouette of an object. It's a visual trick. Games like WoW really use this to great effect. It's one of the reasons why their props and their costumes look so chunky and heavy. Going in the opposite direction, tapering, which is the effect of reducing the size of an object as it goes outwards, creates an effect of lightness, of something that touches the ground more lightly and gently, that's more delicate, without, again, actually having any effect on the weight of the object necessarily. Because 3D weight is an illusion, and so we can play with people's perceptions of how heavy or light something is. Or if you use it in character design, you can create the effect of a character who looks like he's lighter on his feet, that maybe he moves faster, like the guy over on the end here. And that's all down to his silhouette tapering towards the ends. So a big concept thing, authenticity. What I really mean by that is creating rich, believable, convincing worlds, creating art that tells a story about its history and its context. So there's a couple of things that you can use to create this. Understanding the cultural context of an object that you're replicating. So either you might be replicating it from a real culture, or you might be creating your own fictional culture that it exists in. But using things like repeating patterns and motifs that that particular culture may have used in their art and their objects versus a different culture that had different sets of patterns and colours and things that they use, what materials they had access to, and what kind of techniques they would have used to create their objects given the materials that they were working with. And then, of course, real objects don't spring into existence. They have their own personal history. And looking at how an object's actually constructed, what materials it was made out of, and how it's aged. Has it corroded? Has it faded in areas that are more prone to use? Can tell a story about an object that makes it feel much more real and grounded, even if it's a fantasy culture that you're creating. So over there in Journey, we don't really see the culture that created these wonderful ruins, but they're all tied together and obviously from a similar culture based on the repeating geometric motif that you find on all of the architecture. God of War is obviously a pure fantasy. It's got magic and gods in it, but it's also very grounded and real. And one of the ways that they do that is through the costuming and the amount of detail and realism that they put into things like the leather weaving on his shoulder piece there, or the stitching on his little leather skirt and the way that it's faded where it would have been rubbed and used. And I also include this last one because the bin chicken should get a chance to ride again. I made this for Dora in the Lost City, and I was researching the way that Egyptians create their golden statues, and they don't paint the gold on, they actually use gold leaf, which is really thin sheets of gold that's laminated over the top of a object, and it ages in a very different way. And we were creating these to be museum exhibits within the film, so they needed to have that sense of realism of being both authentically fabricated and very old, aged in the appropriate way. So this was the reference that I was given for the Lamassu, the winged bull god that I showed you earlier. And one of the things that I feel like all artists understand the importance of using reference, right? But there's a difference between primary and secondary reference. Secondary reference is an image or object that has already gone through one iteration of an artist's reinterpretation of it. So I was given a bunch of reference to create this object, and one of them was this picture up here, the freestanding one. They wanted a freestanding statue because they were going to be placing it in Dora's house. But when I started doing some research about what these objects were, I realized that that would have been really, really difficult. It wouldn't have been authentic at all. Because for a start, this one over on your right is about this tall, and it's made of bronze. And the original ones were huge statues that were made of stone. And obviously, stone statues that look like that would not have been freestanding because stone is very brittle and it would have crumbled under the weight. It's the same reason that you see all of those marble statues with the limbs that have cracked off, because it's a brittle material. Also, the original was designed to be a guardian of the king. So these were built into the doorways of the palace. So they always appeared as like a relief image rather than a freestanding object. And if you look very closely, you can see that he's actually got 5 legs. So that from, yeah, not the way you're thinking. So that from the side, he looks like he is striding out of the gates to protect the king, but from the front, he looks like he's standing guard. So there's all this symbolism in the original, and there's all this information that you don't get if you only have a look at the secondary reference. So while it's fine to use reference, which is a secondary reference, it's important to understand that you're doing so that you don't miss out on all that extra wonderful information that you would have gotten if you looked at the primary one. So in terms of looking at things, creating convincing textures, understanding your materials, when I came back to games, physically based rendering, PBR, materials were a thing. They hadn't been a thing when I had left. We did everything by hand at that stage. And procedural textures was something you wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. Obviously, the technology has gotten so much better now. And PBR software basically creates a model of the world that simulates the physics that are affecting a material, whether that's the layers of the material, the lighting. And my experience actually working with real materials taught me to understand what I was seeing because I was physically working with them all the time, and to understand their physical real-world properties. So how they're affected by things like light and gravity and corrosion, and how the surface finish affects the amount of gloss that a surface can actually physically pick up. And understanding those concepts by working with the materials allowed me to understand other things where they're attempting to physically recreate the real conditions of the world, like subsurface scattering and ray tracing. PBR materials, and even things like paint simulation brushes that you might get in Photoshop or Painter or something like that, that are recreating the effect of watercolor on paper. Understanding why they work the way they do by really working with the materials that they're simulating. So, I mean, you can learn how to use these materials by just working from within the program, but I think it's a lot more limited. You're really just memorizing what numbers to type in what boxes, what settings to switch on. And I think it's not quite as powerful as actually understanding and having a bit of familiarity with the real materials and understanding why they look the way they do. So I spent a lot of time when I was on Aquaman spray painting, doing automotive spray painting, which is basically the sort of paint finish that you would see on a car or a motorbike, that real high gloss, high quality finish. And so I was able to look at a material like this, a PBR one, and understand what I was seeing. So if you have a look at this one here, it initially appears to be a dark green surface with a light green paint that hasn't quite reached the edges, or perhaps a light green with a dark green highlighting the edges, and it's got a gloss surface on it. But I can tell you from having worked with materials that actually look like this, that what's really going on is you have a dark green surface, but paint, when it's sprayed on a surface, it pulls away from any edges that stand up, and it tends to pool in large flat areas. So I reckon this is probably just one layer over the top. It's a gloss coat. But the reason that it's lightening the green colour is because when you spray on a gloss coat and the conditions are particularly bad, I'm going to turn that on silent, like it's humid, or there's been a lot of moisture in the air because of rain, the coat will do what we call bloom. It'll go milky. And I think that that's what this is actually simulating here. So understanding how those processes work can help you to create a much more interesting and realistic looking texture. Even if people looking at it may not understand why it looks right, we intuitively recognize when things look correct and the way we would expect them to look them in the real world. So a little technique or way of approaching projects that I learned was spending time upfront creating custom tool sets. So when we would approach doing a polystyrene sculpt, we would always make our own custom sanding tools and jigs in order to get the shapes that we wanted, to get into particular, hard to reach areas, or to make a particular curve or a mark that we were going to need to make repeatedly and wanted to make exactly each time rather than having a very rough handmade look. And we can do the same sort of thing when we're working in digital. We can create ZBrush brushes, we can do Photoshop textures and brushes, or Boolean objects when we're working in something like ZBrush, which will allow us to quickly speed up the process after we've made them and make much more consistent marks. So although as an artist it's very tempting to jump right into a project and start making something and producing something visual, it can be worth taking the time to actually set your tools up beforehand and then make the whole process going after that so much easier and better. Another idea that I got from actually working with real materials is stepping back from your work. And obviously this is pretty self-explanatory when you're working on a 4-meter tall statue, because you can only ever be as far away as your arm can reach, otherwise you're not working on the project. So when I was working on this guy, I had to practically get onto the other side of the room before I could really get everything into frame and see what I was working on. And so I learnt to do that when I was working, but I realized that we sometimes forget to do that when we're working in digital, because we do work really zoomed into something that we're working on so that we can get in the detail and be able to see what we're doing. But we need to remember when the viewer isn't actually going to see it that close, we need to be zooming out to the same distance that they will see it on screen to make sure that all of that detail that we're putting in, the effort to make, is actually going to read on screen, that the silhouette is still going to read at the distance and the angle that you see the character on screen. I see a lot of games where they've obviously put a lot of time and effort into creating an amazing costume for their character, and then they have like a real top-down, really zoomed out sort of perspective, and you can't see any of it. And it's really, frustrating as the viewer that you aren't able to appreciate all of that hard effort that went into it. So another concept that I sort of came across doing practical production is understanding the difference between the concepting stage and the production stage. So being creative in the concept stage and being process-driven in the production stage. Because all artists are technicians, ultimately. We're creatives, but we also have to make the art that we're creating. So we have to approach it in that way when we're actually doing the fabrication of stuff. And it's important to work out your art pipeline. How are you going to make this? Think it through from the beginning to the end so that you don't get stuck part way or find that you suddenly can't make changes halfway through because of the way that you've structured your workflow. And also having care and skill at each step of the process, even when those aren't particularly creative or exciting steps. When I was working on Aquaman, I showed you those guns that I was spray painting. They had a very involved process just for creating the paint job. They were a big prop that had to go through a lot of different departments. We were the last stage in the painting department, and it was a very multi-step process where if we were sloppy or just didn't take care in an early stage of the process, we would really make our work much harder and it wouldn't look as good in a later step of the process. So this particular job was actually a very technical process and taught me a lot about how to approach doing an art pipeline for creating a creative project. Of course, all that said, sometimes that just doesn't come together as an artist, no matter what industry you're working in. So what I kind of took away from this process was that the traditional art concepts and knowing materials still matter when you're a digital artist, and we can't leave that, that history behind. So I guess I came back to where I started, back in games, but I didn't really come back to the beginning. I was actually a lot further along my journey as an artist than I was when I started. And it's not the end of that journey. I've realized that all learning when it comes to art is transferable skills. It's all transferable experience. And taking a detour into a different industry didn't set me back, ultimately. It actually made me a more diverse, more adaptable artist. I found coming back into digital, I was less risk averse, and I was more confident in my ability to learn new skills because I'd gone through this process of learning some really different skills, coming back into digital, just approaching something like a new piece of software or even going from 3D to 2D suddenly didn't seem that hard. So, how to avoid serving coffee to pay the bills? Not that I have anything against waitresses, I've been one at many times in my life. But the face of the industry, especially in Australia, has really changed, especially since I got in here about 15 years ago. In the last decade or so, our industry has really transformed into something where freelancing and small teams are a lot more common. And I think that having a diverse skill set as an artist in that context is really important because in a small team, there may not be enough artists for everyone to specialize. So understanding how to work within UI or character art or environment art or special effects and being able to contribute to all of those different areas can make you a much more valuable member of the team. And I think that having a long-term career as an artist in any area, we really need to diversify. And whether or not that looks like using your skills to move into different industries, you know, doing graphic design or CAD as a freelancer in between games contracts, or whether that just means that you're a more well-rounded games artist within the team that you're working in. I mean, I took a long detour to becoming a better games artist, and you don't have to follow in my footsteps. But I actually left games to retrain because I felt like I had put all of my eggs in one very small basket, and I didn't feel like my actual art training was very deep. It was actually very shallow and very game specific. And I found that digital artists, we don't often get a lot of traditional art training, strangely enough. Practical artists get traditional art training, and they can learn how to use digital tools. And that's what I mean by understanding the difference between the principles and the methods, or the tools and the techniques. And games training can be a little bit insular if you don't look at outside and actually get some of that more traditional arts training. If you only look at making art from within how it's made for games and how it's been made for games in the past, then you can miss out on a lot of inspiration and really great concepts that will make your art a lot stronger. So I found that going outside of games and getting some of that traditional art training actually gave me something to bring back to games. So I always used to have a lot of trouble with what to put on my business card, how to describe myself as a professional. What do I do? Am I an automotive spray painter? Am I a digital sculptor? You know, do I do graphic design? And ultimately, I came to peace with the idea that I'm an artist, I'm a sculptor, and I'm a painter, and I work in games, or I work in theatre, or I work in film, and separating out those concepts. And when I was doing my research for this talk, I came across this word. Those of you paying attention may have realized this is not the name of my talk. But I like this term so much better. Interdisciplinary means integrating knowledge and methods from different disciplines. And I like that because that's ultimately what I'm talking about here. And I think that this concept is a lot more inclusive because it's simply about understanding how these concepts, these methods, can help you in your own discipline. I actually came across some really great GDC talks when I was researching for how to do a talk, because I don't talk very often in front of people like this. And I found a lot of people are talking about this, about games artists going outside of their industry to find different techniques and learning experiences and inspiration. There was a great one that was about looking at home reno shows and how that can teach you to create better interior levels for your games. And there's another one, in fact, this chick, Victoria Tran, she's going to be talking here, and she was talking about the role of fashion and how understanding fashion can make you a better character concept artist when creating costumes. So I also found a lot of artists actually did get their training outside of games when they were first training, and they brought that knowledge into their games training or their games experience when they moved into this industry. But like I said, I don't think that working outside of the industry is something you need to do to benefit from this concept, and simply using these ideas as a learning tool is enough, and you can make a lot better game art because of that. So I hope that I've inspired you to broaden your art experience if you are an artist, and to look to other disciplines for some inspiration, and to hopefully become an interdisciplinary artist too. So thank you very much. So hopefully we've left enough time to have a bit of Q&A if I have talked about anything that you'd like to ask about, or if I haven't talked about something that you'd like to ask about. Oh, yes, I think that we need to... Oh, yeah, that's right. This is getting recorded, guys. You're all on camera.
Hello. Cool.
Yep.
So I'm a 3D artist, and I trained in 3D art, but I'm very bad at classical art, which I think isn't uncommon, but it's something I'm trying to force myself to do. Would you have any tips or tricks or recommendations?
Yeah, I would say go back to that classical art and have a look at some more traditional books that talk about doing it, and get your hands dirty and actually try making something in clay to test this out, because you will still have to use all of the same conceptual ideas, which is where the good art thing comes from. If you're already technically proficient in the program, just working in the program isn't necessarily going to make you a better artist. You definitely need to go back to some more traditional art concepts, and I would say do life drawing as well. It's drawing rather than sculpting, but it can really help with just your observational skills, like learning to understand what you're seeing. And life drawing often uses the concept of breaking the body shape down into its basic, like primitive. That's not the right word.
Primitive?
Primitive, thank you. Shape components, and how they go together to make the more complicated anatomy. So sort of seeing the simple shapes within the more complicated shape is a good place to start.
Thank you. Cheers.
Hi, first of all, wonderful talk.
Second,
Having a lot of sort of niche obsessions with a bunch of different physical and traditional art mediums, but not having actually produced any body of work or a decent body of work digitally within a game's within the game's field, how could I, or how have you marketed yourself in a digital industry with 3D, physical skills that you haven't really have a folio of? That makes sense.
I suppose getting a folio is always a good start.
Yeah.
I think
true.
it's a good thing, because practicing those skills can also really reinforce them a lot more. So is it that you don't have a portfolio of stuff that you've created, you've sort of just studied the concepts?
Yeah, it's more like, I guess I don't have a folio of finished physical stuff, but I've had a lot of experience practicing, and prototyping.
Ah, okay. I guess a lot of that can be stuff that you can put in a portfolio, being able to see the process of how it's created. But I don't know, I think that, having a portfolio is important, because that is kind of how we get hired as artists, is being able to demonstrate our skills. So it can be quite difficult to do that if you haven't got something to show for it. I would say spend a little bit of time working on creating that portfolio. Would probably be the...
Will do, thank you.
Sorry, I can't be more helpful.
Hi, I actually started with fine arts first, and now I'm moving into digital art. And do you have any tips regarding with like catching up with new software, new programs? Because I'm really having a hard time with that.
Yeah, I think that that's a great place to start from because, you know, conceptually you already understand it. Yeah, I wonder if, like, you know, working with some of the ideas I was talking about in reverse, you know, approaching things the way that you would have if it had been a traditional program. In that way, I suppose that perhaps ZBrush, if you're looking to become a 3D artist, would be more intuitive as a method to start doing 3D sculpting. Yeah, I guess there's a lot of tutorials online. It's tricky. It is really about just going back to basics and learning the tools and understanding how the digital program is trying to replicate those ideas. But yeah, it's one of those. I don't mean to say when I sort of, you know, said I keep building on the skills that there is no sort of pause of having to step back and retrain. There is like a little while where you have to be bad at something before you can get good because, yeah, you sort of got to start at the beginning. I think there is a great program, actually, Sculptress, which is kind of like ZBrush, but it's like the Bibby version without all of the technical stuff that you probably won't need to know how to use. So that's a good one to kind of get into doing that kind of 3D sculpting without having to know the program inside out to get familiar with the concept. I would say find a 3D program that's easy for you to learn and learn how to use 3D. I actually learnt on Macs originally and then had to transfer to Maya for my first job. That was first thing I had to do. First day, here's a copy of the manual of Maya, retrain. But I found that it was easier once I understood how 3D programs of that sort put together 3D models. I guess understanding if you're becoming a 3D artist, that different sorts of 3D software approach the problem very differently. Something like ZBrush or those sort of sculpting programs are very different to use from something like Rhino, which is more CAD-based, versus something that's more like a polygon model program. They have very different conceptual methodologies for how you approach creating 3D programs. So I suppose figure out what kind of 3D program is part of the industry that you would like to work in and, you know, find one that's like that, or, you know, the simplest one that you can learn to get the concepts down.
Hey, so
Hey.
do you think this idea of having multiple disciplines under your belt is going to become the standard in the games industry as we move on and, yeah, as we move on?
I think in Australia it's definitely become more of a thing. I started in games in Australia when we had more mid-sized companies and you could be a specialist because there were enough people in an arts team that you could have people who only did one very small thing. And I think that in industries that are still very large and have really large companies over in America and the UK, that's still the norm where you can be a very specialist artist. But I am seeing the Australian games industry kind of go into an area where you really need to be able to do things across a whole bunch of different areas because the teams are so small that you can't be too much of a specialist in a team that maybe has 2 artists in it. Yeah, so I think just the way that we're going towards you know, smaller teams and working on mobile and things like that also, you know, you tend to have a much smaller team. So I think that if you want to stay in Australia at the moment, yeah, that's probably something which is good. And if you don't work in a dedicated team for a particular company, being a freelancer, being able to take on jobs in a variety of different areas means that you have a lot more job opportunities that you can take on because you're not just like, oh, I can only do jobs that fit this very rigid set of criteria. If you can do a lot of different things as a freelancer, it gives you a lot more flexibility to take on different jobs.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, someone back there?
Hey, what made you decide to go back into games?
Ooh, quite a number of things. Film it's a tricky industry. It's a very demanding industry. that I don't think I appreciated when I was training to go into it. I actually didn't realise the hours that they do until I did my first internship in my last year of uni, and they do 10-hour days as standard, 12 if you're in New Zealand or Canada. So it's already a much longer working day, and they do overtime on top of that. And it's a physically demanding industry. Obviously, you are physically making things, so things like working on huge polystyrene sculptures, you are working with your hands all day, and that can be quite physically tiring as well. I was finding that my work-life balance working in film was getting a little bit out of whack, and the idea of coming back to games actually seemed like a nice sort of refreshing change. And coming back, I really appreciate a lot of the good things, like how good we have it in games, and I know that we don't always. We do have crunch time, we do have, you know, difficult bosses, we have inter-office politics, but honestly, nothing like what I experienced in film. Not to put anyone off working in film, it has a lot of really good points, but it definitely made me appreciate how good we sometimes have it in games in a way that you don't always appreciate if it's the only thing you've ever experienced. Yep. All right, that's it.